Hello, everyone. This is the Olympic ships of the White Star Line. My name is Dr. Brad Sauls, and I'll be talking about the RMS Olympic, the RMS Titanic, and the RMS Britannic today. And I hope you enjoy this presentation. I want to jump right into this presentation, going over what the White Star Line was. It was a shipping company that was founded way back in the early 1840s, so it's quite old, or was old at the time. It was started out with a different name, though, called the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, and it was basically used to transport goods across really all over the world for the most part, but mainly from England to south, back to the United States, excuse me. And over time, though, the profits went down and they went bankrupt. So there was a man named Thomas Ismay that actually took the company out of bankruptcy and purchased it, and he renamed the company the White Star Line. And instead of focusing on goods, he actually started to focus more on passenger transport. And of course, they had a small fleet of ships already, so he basically ordered new ships and redesigned a lot of their existing ships to be used as passenger liners versus goods. And it was actually a very profitable industry at the time because many people were immigrating to various parts of the world. And so he was going to capitalize on that. In later years, though, his son, J. Bruce Ismay, whose picture's on the slide there, was appointed the head of the company once Thomas Ismay had passed away in the late 1890s. And Bruce Ismay was a very competitive man, and his focus more on luxury versus speed because his main competitor, the Cunard Line, which is still around today, focused more on being very quick to get to its destinations. But it also focused a lot on luxury too, but just not as much as White Star did. But a little bit of forward history for you in regard to these two companies. In the 1930s and 1934, these two companies did merge due to the recommendation of the British government because both companies were going to go bankrupt because that was the years of the Great Depression that affected many companies around the world. So they merged the two. And in 1950, Cunard actually purchased the last remnants of the White Star shares and basically absorbed that company. And from then on out, it was basically just Cunard. So in 1907, it says after increasing competition from the Cunard shipping line via their ships, the Lusitania and Mauretania, three Olympic class vessels were ordered from Harland and Wolff, just shipyards, which were the largest at the time. Harland and Wolff was the shipbuilders for White Star Line. There was many shipbuilders around the world at that time, but Harland and Wolff was actually the one that White Star used. These three ships were going to be around $7.5 million each, plus 5% was going to be the cost of these three ships. So he got a pretty good deal for these three ships. These ships were going to be the largest in the world. They were going to be even larger than the Mauretania and the Lusitania, which were Cunard liners, which were rather large at the time. They were actually the largest at the time. So he wanted to outdo them and become even more luxurious than they were, but not as quick, but offering that luxury that people really paid for back in those days. So here's a picture of the RMS Mauretania. RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship, in case you're wondering. It was a four-funnel ship. You can see all the ventilations there on the ship, all the lifeboats. A very beautiful ship. Mauretania was around a long time. Cunard used this ship a very, very long time. It was kind of the lead vessel in their fleet, you could say. They were very proud of the Mauretania. It was a very beautiful ship, a very fast ship. And they kept it around a long time till eventually they had to scrap it due to its age. And it went around, it actually lasted to around the 1930s. It was scrapped around the same time Olympic was. The RMS Lusitania, another ship, beautiful ship. You can see all the lifeboats and all the passengers that were on this ship, four funnels too. This ship was not scrapped. It actually was sunk in World War I. Actually, it was hit by a mine, and there was a lot of controversy around this ship and how it sank, which I may do a presentation on Lusitania down the road, but it has a very interesting history too, but a very beautiful ship. And it also was a Cunard liner too, but it focused more on speed versus luxury. But also it was very luxurious inside, but just not as luxurious as the White Star liners would be. So a lot of people, when they think of these Olympic class ships, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, because Bruce Ismay's dream was to build the three largest ships in the world that could capitalize on this industry. And a lot of people believe that Thomas Andrews was the man who designed these three ships, and he actually wasn't. The man that initially designed these ships was named Andrew Carlisle, and he was the head designer at Harland and Wolff, but he had a disagreement with the head of Harland and Wolff. The man's name was Lord Peary, over lifeboats, because Ismay and Lord Peary basically were saying people pay for luxury, they don't pay to look at lifeboats. So he had a big disagreement over that because Andrew Carlisle was all about safety and making sure people were taken care of. And if there was a disaster, everyone could be safe and get away from if the ship sinks. But they overruled him, and he got very upset about it, and he basically retired on the spot and left the project while it was still in its infancy. So, but he did retire in 1910 before the two ships were made, the Olympic and Titanic. So Thomas Andrews, this is the man that most people think about when they think of the Titanic and the Olympic. They think of Thomas Andrews because he had, there was an actor that played him in the movie, but he was actually Lord Peary's nephew. And so he kind of, I guess you could say, has some special treatment, some preference there for getting the job once Andrew Carlisle retired. Now, Thomas Andrews did do some designing of the ships. Don't get me wrong, he was a very intelligent man, but he actually helped design more of the interiors of the ships. Not so much the exteriors, but the interiors, which obviously was a very important job too. But a very, very brilliant man. He was definitely ahead of his time and wanted really to have the most luxurious ships in the world. But a very, very talented man. So White Star versus Cunard. So again, Cunard Line had the fastest ships in the world at the time, like the Mauritania, the Lusitania. And again, White Star wanted to emphasize luxury over speed. That was their main focus. Now, Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star, he actually always went on the maiden voyages of all his ships so he could see what improvements could be made for the next ship. So when he went on Olympic's maiden voyage in 1911, he basically sent a telegram back that said, well, the beds are too soft, there's not enough ashtrays in the smoking rooms. And of course, that was all just a jest. He actually approved. These are all good things. And he was very pleased with the Olympics. So, but he was always looking for things that could be improved, like I said, for the next ship. So he was looking around, what can we do better for the Titanic? Because Titanic was still being built when Olympic went on its maiden voyage. And then he did the same thing with Titanic. He was on Titanic to look to see what they can improve on that for Brittanic. So he always went on these ships to inspect them to see what could be changed and updated. So we'll jump right into our presentation here with the RMS Olympic. So here's a picture of the beautiful ship that she was. She was a very large ship. She was a lot larger than Mauritania and Lusitania. One thing you can keep in mind here with the Olympic is you can see here on A deck where our mouse cursor is at, the promenade deck is open. This is an open promenade deck. On Titanic, half of this was partially enclosed because people were complaining about sea spray and getting wet. Obviously, they're in the middle of the ocean, but the waves can get pretty high and people can get wet. And people were complaining about that. So they enclosed most of it, or partially half of this, so people could enjoy the promenade deck without getting hit with water or sea salt and things. So, and people did enjoy that too quite a bit. But they did that on Titanic. On Olympic, it remained open, but on Titanic, they enclosed it, and they did on Britannic too. So just some quick facts about Olympic. Its maiden voyage was June 11th, 1911. It had a gross tonnage of 45,324 tons. That's a very, very heavy ship. It was in service a very long time, from 1911 to 1935. So 24 years this ship served. It was also a troop transport ship in World War I. The British Admiralty actually had agreements with Cunard and White Star and other shipping lines, basically saying if there's any type of wartime scrimmage or anything like that, that they would be able to requisition these ships and turn them into military vessels. And they turned Olympic into a troop transport, and they painted her what we call dazzle camouflage, which I have a picture here in just a few minutes. And they did the same with Britannic. They turned Britannic into a hospital ship. And of course, Titanic never made it to that point, but it most likely would have been also requisitioned as a ship too if it had been around still, if it had not sunk. The length was 882 feet 9 inches. It was the longest serving of the three Olympic ships. It was scrapped in 1935, which is such a shame. I wish they would have kept it around because we would have been able to see what these ships would look like in their heyday. A lot of people say that there was nothing wrong with Olympic when they scrapped her. She was a result of the merger of Cunard and White Star. And Cunard actually scrapped most of the White Star vessels versus her own vessels, their own vessels, the Cunard vessels. But at the same time, Olympic was showing its age. It was going on 25 years old. I know in today's world, they do scrap ships still, even when they're still up in age, and just as Olympic was, but sometimes they keep them around longer than that. They just keep re-updating them. And so they did that with Olympic too. They painted her interiors, they added some modern conveniences. The coal was exchanged out for oil, so it started burning oil instead of coal. But it really had a lot going for it. And a lot of people were very upset when they scrapped it because they felt like she still had many years ahead of her. But they just deemed her outdated at the time. And it was time to move on to newer ships, which people were wanting to go on. They nicknamed her Old Reliable because she was that. She was reliable. She actually got struck by a tidal wave, didn't really damage her. She got struck by another ship. She was repaired, didn't sink her. She was in World War One. She actually sunk a submarine, a German submarine. So she went through a lot, and she was still kicking at the end. But again, she was refitted in the late 20s from coal to oil burning, so which is more of a modern energy source at that time. And here's a picture here, a close-up picture of the Olympic. And you can see here, again, as I said a minute ago, the A-deck promenade was wide open on this ship versus being partially enclosed on Britannic and Titanic. So, and that's what made those ships heavier than Olympic. And remember, Olympic was the first one launched in these three. So I kind of run down some pictures of Olympic. So here is the grand staircase, a very beautiful staircase. You can see the clock back here. I know a lot of people always notice that clock. That clock had a name. It was called Honor and Glory was the name of that clock because you see the two figures that were etched into the wood. You see the dome, the very ornate dome there, glass. It's very, very beautiful, ornate woodwork, very beautiful. And here's one thing though, people don't realize though, when a lot of people see these pictures, see the picture of the grand staircase in some form or fashion. The pictures that you see are not Titanic. That's where most of them say they say this is Titanic's grand staircase. There are actually no known photos of Titanic's grand staircase out there that we know of. The pictures that you do see out there are Olympic, and that is commonly confusing at times because the staircase was not Titanic's, it was Olympic's. So Titanic had, we think, a nearly identical staircase to Olympic, but again, there's no photographs to prove that. And there's actually very few photographs of Titanic, which we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. This was one of the restaurants on Olympic. This is the Cafe Parisien that was added later on. Very, very beautiful. You can see it had a lot of greenery on the walls, ornate windows, and the wicker furniture. So it was a very, very beautiful setting there. And this is what happened when they did the refit of Olympic. They actually painted her grand staircase green. I know a lot of people have mixed reactions on that. Some people like it, some people don't like it. I know most people tend to go for the brown color, but I guess it kind of grows on you after a while. It actually, I don't think looks too bad, but they basically had to work with what they had. They didn't want to gut it and put in something new. So that would cost too much money for a ship that was already 20 years old. So they basically just repainted things and put in new carpets and things like that. Little cosmetic things they could do to change things up a little bit. These ships did have gems on them, which was kind of ahead of its time. I know this picture's a little blurry here, but Titanic's and Olympic's gem were nearly identical. I do have a better picture of Titanic's here in a little bit. You can see the rowing machine here. They had what they call an electric camel. Think of like an exercycle that we have today. They had what we call electric camels that people could ride on. And they also, the flooring is not tile, by the way. It's actually linoleum. So that was a technology that was ahead of its time during the 1911, 1912 years. We didn't have linoleum back then. So it was a new thing. It was a new type of flooring. And today we have it in our bathrooms and places like that. But back then that was a a technology that was ahead of its time. It was a very expensive technology, and White Star had this on their ships. But again, it did have a gym, and the gym was for first class passenger use only. And just as the grand staircase too was only for first class passengers. Here is a first class stateroom. You can see it's very beautiful, very ornate, mahogany paneling, fine carpeting, a settee, this couch here, light fixtures, marble countertops, bathroom fixtures. This a very, very beautiful setting here. And these rooms would go anywhere from $4 to $15 to $20,000. And so that's people paid for this. Not all rooms had private bathrooms. Most of the bathrooms were common areas. Some staterooms did have private bathrooms, but not many. As time went on, they did add private bathrooms to first class as the years went on. And here's another picture of a very ornate and beautiful first class stateroom. Very, very ornate, very beautiful. Again, you can see the detailing on the walls, the light fixtures, the bedding, everything, the marble sinks. Basically, no expense was spared for these rooms. And again, people paid a lot of money for these rooms. So they they wanted to get what they paid for, obviously, but very beautiful, very ornate. So here's the third class deck. So you can see here the third class, basically their promenade deck was basically in an area that was still a working part of the ship. So they had the ropes here that they would tie the ship up to when it was in dock. This was basically in the stern area of the ship, so the rear part of the ship. And you see the ventilation pipes here. So it was really not the best place to kind of mingle and talk to people, but it did have benches for people to sit on. There was a lot of noise obviously going on because it is a working part of the ship. But like I said, this would not be anything comparable to first class. First class had a promenade deck on their own that was secluded, and it was much higher up so they could get better views. So definitely two different perspectives here. So here's a second class stateroom. You can see it's quite different from first class. So second class still had the beds, but just not as nice. You don't see the mahogany wood paneling. You see a little bit of it here, but the walls were not covered with it. These are basically the steel walls, the sinks, not as luxurious. The carpeting was not as luxurious, but still not too bad. It basically had the basic necessities, and of course no private bathrooms. They basically had common areas for bathrooms. Here's a third class room. Now, this is a small one, and this is a 2 bunk. Sometimes they would have actually 3 bunks on one side and 3 bunks on the other. So some of these third class rooms could hold 6 people. Basically, just had a sink and a mirror and some towels. That's basically all they had because the bathrooms were common areas again. Third class on these Olympic class liners was very similar to second class in terms of bunking with people. If a person was traveling alone, they would put them in a room with other people. Now, obviously, if there was a family, they would have their own room. But generally, if it was just one person, they would be put in a room with other people. So it wasn't uncommon for 6 people to be in a room because sometimes there would be like 6 bunks in a room. And that's just what it was. And even first class tickets were quite expensive back in those days. A third class ticket may cost around $600. And on today's money, that's still a lot of money today, but that would get you a nice stateroom on a modern day cruise ship. But that's what it would get you back in 1912. So definitely two different worlds there. So you can see the first class dining room on Olympic and the reading and drawing room, very luxurious, very ornate. The tables are very set beautifully with fine china and silverware. They had chair coverings and very luxurious chairs, leather, all leather, ornate ceilings. And Titanic's dining room looked identical to this one. This was Olympic, but first class obviously sat with their families or however they were traveling. Second class and third class did not do that, though. They had to sit together for the most part, with a few exceptions. The reading and drawing room, again, very ornate, very beautiful furniture. One thing about why they reading and drawing room is a lot of people's like, why do they call it a drawing room? And the reason is because back in those days, when people would, after dinner, they would withdraw to a room to relax or smoke a cigar or drink coffee. And that's why they call it a drawing room, because you're drawing away from something. So that's why they call it a drawing room. So people may go in there to read letters, write letters, smoke a cigar. just relax after dinner, have a cup of coffee, whatever it may be. So here's the third class dining and smoking room. So you can see definitely two different perspectives from a first class. So the third class smoking room was basically just benches and a few tables, nothing as ornate as the first class. And of course, the dining facility was, I would kind of relate it to more almost like a lunchroom that you would see in a high school, because you had all the ventilation exposed, the piping exposed, and that was not the case in first class. First class had carpeting and ornate ceilings, and they didn't have that in third class, obviously. With their second class, though, they had an ornate ceiling, very beautiful light fixtures. Their tables were quite longer, so they would accommodate more people on a table. So they may be 3 or 4 families sitting together at a table. But the difference is between second and third class is second class had tablecloths. They had china, also not as fine china as first class would. But their dining room spanned the entire width of the ship, the second class did. So a very beautiful paneling. So no, second class, like I said, wasn't too bad. First class was a little bit more personable, but it was definitely not too bad, and it was definitely different from third class. Here is the swimming pool on Olympic. Olympic actually was not the first ship that was swimming pool. There was other ships that had pools at the time, but it was still kind of a newer technology. Men and women visited the pools at different times. They were not allowed to go together because this was a different era. You actually had to pay to visit the pool, and it was in today's money, it would have been around $1. They had to purchase the tickets on C deck, and the pool, it was on F deck. And the pool was actually filled with seawater, and it was heated by the boilers, boilers were right underneath the pool there, so it would heat the water. They had changing rooms over here for people to change in, just like you would see in today's gyms and things. But like I said, men and women had to go at different times to visit the pool. And this was actually only for first class passengers. This was not for second or third class, only for first class. So the RMS Olympic, again, remember the promenade, this is a beautiful colorized picture of it, had a open promenade versus Titanic's partially closed. The Cafe Parisian that we saw earlier was actually installed on Olympic afterwards, after Titanic sank. And again, it was the first in the 3 ships, the first launch of the 3 sisters. So here's a picture of Olympic during World War One with its dazzle camouflage. So, and the reason they had these weird shapes and paint colors was to confuse the enemy vessels, because if they were looking at it from a distance, they wouldn't be able to tell what way it was going. So it was designed to confuse them, so they couldn't fire on it. They didn't know which way it was going. All right, so moving on to the second sister, the Titanic, which is probably the most popular ship in history. The Titanic was a tragedy, obviously. A lot of people lost their lives on the Titanic. So it was maiden voyage was in April 10th, 1912. So about almost a year after Olympic. It had about 1,000 more tons than Olympic because of the enclosed promenade. So its gross tonnage was 46,328. It didn't really have any years of service. It was basically just about a week. Its length was the same as Olympic, 882 feet 9 inches. And again, it was larger than Olympic by gross tonnage, and it was sunk due to an iceberg collision on April 15th, 1912. It sits in 12,500 feet in the ocean. That's how deep the Titanic is. So it's not easy to get to, I guess you could say. They have to use submersibles to get to it. And 1,503 people died on the disaster, on the wreck. It carried 2,206 people, 1,503 people died, and only 703 survived. So because there wasn't enough lifeboats on the ship. One thing I mentioned earlier about the pictures of the Titanic, there are actually very few photos of Titanic's interiors and exteriors for that matter. The reason is because Olympic was launched first, and Olympic, when it was launched, it was the largest ship in the world, and it was a big deal. So they took lots of pictures of it, the interiors, the exteriors. I mean, there's just tons of pictures out there with Olympic. When Titanic was launched about a year later, yeah, there was a lot of buzz around it. They were excited about it, but it was nearly identical to Olympic. So they were like, we've already taken pictures of these ships already. We already know what it kind of looks like, with the exception of a few differences. So that's one reason why you don't see a lot of pictures of Titanic, is because there just wasn't enough PR about it, because they had already saw Olympic. And so here's a picture of just kind of gives you the scale of how big these ships were. One thing I do want to mention is the fourth funnel on these ships was not used. It was basically just there for aesthetic reasons, just for looks, basically, and maybe to have some ventilation for the kitchens. The first three funnels were used for the coal, for the smoke to be emitted. The fourth funnel, again, was just there for looks. And here's a picture of what Titanic looks like underwater. If you kind of piece them together, that's what they would look like. The stern is a complete wreck. It's in really bad shape. But if you could kind of piece them together, that's what it would look like today versus what it looked like when it was together. So again, its voyage started on April 10th, 1912, so 5 days before the disaster. It left Southampton, England for Cherbourg, France, and arrives around 8 p.m. Then Titanic then goes to Queenstown, Ireland, and on April 12th, the ship is on her way to New York. So it was well on its way. An iceberg was spotted at 11:35 p.m. and 11:40 p.m. It collided with the iceberg and it then sank about 2.5 hours later at 2:20 a.m. to the bottom of the ocean on April 15th. So looking at some people that were on Titanic too, Captain Smith, Edward Smith, was the Commodore of the White Star Fleet. He was highly regarded as one of the best captains in basically all the shipping lines. People actually wanted to be on the ships with Captain Smith because he had many, many years of experience. He knew what he was doing. He was a professional. He prided himself with safety. Of course, he had nothing to do with the lifeboats, but he did pride himself on being safe and having a well-ran ship, which he did. He obviously did not survive the disaster. He went down with the ship. His body was never recovered. But he was actually the captain on the Olympic. And then when Titanic was launched, he moved over to Titanic. And that was actually going to be his last position. He was going to retire after Titanic's voyage. But he was the Commodore of the White Star Fleet. So here's a comparison contrast to these two ships. So again, they were nearly identical in a lot of ways. Titanic was launched a year later. So you can see the differences between the two at the promenade. So the open promenade deck on Olympic versus the partially enclosed promenade on Titanic. So you can see it right there, that enclosed promenade deck. This is Titanic's gym. So you can see here, there was some people working out on an exercycle there. And it may look kind of funny with this lady wearing a dress and a hat and a man wearing a suit. But again, you got to remember, this was a different era. This was during the Edwardian era in the early 1900s. And back then, people didn't really show skin like they do today. When you go to a gym today, you wear shorts or a t-shirt or a tank top or something. They wouldn't have dared do those things back then. They were more self-aware of how they looked. And so people wore dresses and they wore suits on these things. Some people did have some workout outfits, but they basically were clothed. Basically from their neck down. They didn't wear shorts or anything. They basically were covered because that was kind of the protocol back in those days. But it did have a well-equipped gym, to say the least. And here's a picture of that gym right here. Again, it was just like the one on Olympic that we saw earlier. Of course, very ornate columns, the rowing machine. There's the electric camel back there, some other apparatuses there. Very, very beautiful. Some posters on the wall, paintings of the world and the ship. So very, very beautiful. And again, this was only for first class passengers. Here's a picture of the Turkish baths. This was actually on Olympic as well, Olympic and Titanic. It didn't get much use on Titanic because one thing about Titanic is when it was launched, there was still many parts of the ship that were not 100% complete. And so they were going to work on it when they got to New York and back to Southampton. Basically, in between voyages, they were going to work a little bit on it, but they were anxious to get it launched. The Turkish bath was one of those areas that was not 100% complete, but it was mostly complete. So it was only open for a few hours on the second night. And this was the same area where the pool was located. And again, this was for first class passengers, and you had to have a ticket to visit the pool and the Turkish bath. And a Turkish bath was basically an area where one would relax. It was very calming, quiet area. People may get a massage, maybe visit the pool afterwards. The pool area was in this area. And that's one thing about the wreckage that we'll see here in a few minutes is there's actually a watertight door that leads to the pool for the Turkish baths, but it's closed, so they can't access it when they visit the wreck. So again, Titanic's pool was nearly identical to Olympics. Again, it costed $1 and it included their admission to the Turkish baths as well. And it was on C deck was where they purchased the tickets on the purser's office, and the pool was on F deck. And again, men and women do attend at separate times. And here's a picture here of some gentlemen working out in the gym. The pictures that you are seeing were taken by a man named Father Francis Brown, and he actually boarded Titanic in Southampton, and he disembarked Titanic in Queenstown, Ireland. So he didn't obviously he didn't need to go to New York. He was just going to Ireland. So he took pictures of Titanic while he was on it. And if it wasn't for him, we probably wouldn't have many pictures of Titanic, because it's his pictures that we see today of Titanic. So we can thank him for the few pictures that we have of Titanic. But again, nearly identical to Olympic. Someone's back here on the electric camel, and you got a gentleman here on the rowing machine. This gentleman, I can't remember his name, or both these gentlemen's names, but he was a personal trainer. And in today's terms, he would be a personal trainer. And he was highly regarded as being an expert in training people, training athletes. But he did not survive the sinking. Neither did this gentleman back here. Neither one of them survived the sinking. But you can see he's got looks like some, I don't know if that's sweats or whatever he's got on, but some kind of clothing, but he's covered basically. And this gentleman back here is wearing a suit. And again, that was not uncommon in those days to be dressed like that when you worked out. Here is a very, very blurry picture of Titanic's dining room. It looks very similar to Olympics we saw earlier. The leather chairs, the ornate ceilings, the columns, very, very beautiful setting. Here's a picture of some people on the deck. This looks like it was probably second class, because first class would have been on the next deck up. So that looks like that was probably second class deck these people were on. And here's a picture of the promenade. This would have been the first class area. So you can see all the deck chairs, the beautiful views of the ocean that these people would have. The deck was teak wood, so it would resist water, which that teak wood is still on the decks in the wreck today. But very, very beautiful. And here's another picture of the deck. And this is third class, their promenade deck, a little bit more closer picture. You see people sitting on the benches, knitting, sewing. And this was in April. You may wonder why they're wearing, it looks like some cloaks and shawls and things. It was a very cold climate still during that time. It was in early April, so it's still kind of cold. So people were bundled up pretty well. And this is actually one of the last known photos of Titanic's journey to New York City as it left Queenstown. So one of the last pictures of it before it went off onto that fateful night. So they think this is the possible iceberg that sank the Titanic. We will never know 100% for sure, but this photo was taken a few days after the Titanic sank, and this iceberg was still in the vicinity of the wreckage. Obviously, it was not too far away from it, of where it collided with Titanic. And the reason they think this is the one that sank Titanic is because you can see it has a dark streak here, and that's actually paint. It's got red paint on it, and Titanic had red paint on it, and they think this is an indication that this iceberg collided with a ship, and they think this is the one that did it. And obviously, this is a lot larger than what it appears to be. The iceberg was so large, it actually towered over the ship. And the saying is there's 1/8 above the surface and 7/8 below. So most of the iceberg is below the surface. So some of the other people that were on the Titanic, J.J. Astor was the richest man on the Titanic. In 1912, he was worth $87 million. That would be around close to $3 billion in today's money, about 2.75. Very, very wealthy man, one of the wealthiest in the world, actually. He did not make it. He also died in the disaster. The Strausses, Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, he was the co-owner of Macy's department store, which is still around today. They also did not survive. Mrs. Strauss was actually allowed to get into a lifeboat, but she did not want to go. She wanted to stay with her husband, and she gave up her seat to her maids. So she gave them her fur coat and other things. So she passed on some of her belongings to them, and they both died in the tragedy. The Countess of Rothes. This lady did survive. She died in 1956. She was portrayed in the movie, and in the movie, they kind of gave her a bad rap. They actually kind of made her look kind of snobby, with her nose in the air. She was not like that. She was actually a very caring and nice and warm lady. When the survivors were picked up and put on the Carpathia, the rescue ship, she was actually going around comforting people, trying to nurse people. She had some medical knowledge, so she wanted to help people as much as she can. She donated to a lot of charities. She really cared a lot about people. And so the movie kind of gives her a bad reputation, but she was nothing like that. But that's how Hollywood makes it. But she did die in 1956. So she died a long time after the sinking. This is another famous person that was on the Titanic. She was named Molly Brown. She died in 1932. She also was portrayed in the movie, a very, very charismatic lady. She actually grew up in poverty, but her husband struck gold in a gold mine. So they instantly became wealthy. And she basically did a lot of charity work too, like the Countess of Roths. She cared a lot about people. She actually raised money to help people that lost everything in the Titanic disaster. She actually helped give out awards to the captain of the Carpathia for saving them and started a fund to help third class passengers. So there was actually a lot of good-hearted people on the Titanic that were first class. A lot of, like I said, the movies kind of make the first class people look kind of arrogant and stuck up, and that was not the case with a lot of these people. A lot of these people were very nice and warm people who cared about others, and so they did a good job at doing that and taking care of others. Joseph LaRoche, he died in 1912. This gentleman right here, he was actually one of the few African Americans on the Titanic, and he was an engineer, very, very intelligent man, ahead of his time. And his family, his wife, his two children did make it. They were on their way to the United States to pick up a trip to Haiti, where he was from. He did not make it. He died in a disaster, but his family did make it, but he didn't, unfortunately. Here, this is pictures of the wreckage. This picture here is the Turkish baths underwater that you would see today. You can see it's actually looks pretty good still. These are tiles and they're very ornate, very beautiful. The stained glass windows, the light fixtures, it still looks pretty good. And there's a door here. The pool door is in this room too, but again, it's closed because it's a watertight door. They can't get access to that because the door's shut. That probably won't happen until one of these floors collapses, in on itself. So then they could get access to it. But I don't know if that'll ever happen. Or it will happen one day. We just don't know when. So here's another picture of the wreckage. This is the stern. The stern doesn't even look like a stern of the ship. If someone was to ask you what this was, if you didn't know, if I just told you, you'd probably be like, "What is that?" It's just a mess of just steel and cables, just twisted and turned. It is a complete mess. When the stern went down with the Titanic, it basically, they think it spiraled on the way down. And then when it crashed on the seabed, it basically forced up the propellers. You can see them right here, about 30 feet up into the air. And so we can see the propellers, the rudder is still buried in the mud as well as the central propeller, but this is just a mess that it basically pancaked on itself when it hit the bottom. And here's another view of the stern. Again, it's basically just a shell of its former self. It's literally just littered the seafloor with steel. And this is actually the mast, the rear mast. And it looks like there's some heaters and things, boilers laying around. I mean, it's just a total mess. Not much left there. And that's one reason why they don't explore the stern very much, is because it's pancaked on itself, and it's a very dangerous area because you don't know when this stuff's going to just collapse in on itself. So that's why they kind of stay away from the stern. Here's a picture of Titanic's engines. This is also in the stern area. They're exposed to the water. The Titanic, when it split in half, it kind of split in half where the engines were. So that's why we see this area. And on the bow section, which we'll see in a minute, it was basically where the kitchen area was at. So that's why we see a lot of champagne bottles and kitchenware, because these areas were where the engines and kitchen areas were located. But these engines are about 30 feet tall. So they're very, very large. They weigh several tons each. They were once connected. And of course, now they're mostly rusted. But at the time, they were marvels of engineering. Here's the bow. This was taken by Magellan Technologies about 2 years ago. They sent some rovers down there to take pictures of the debris field and the ship itself, the stern and the bow. This is the bow. The bow obviously looks a lot better than the stern does. It is declining. Obviously, it's deteriorating. You can see a lot of mess back here deteriorating. This is where it's split open or broken half. There's boilers exposed back here. There you can see the breakage here where it landed. The mud was pulled up, and this ship, the bow of the ship sits about 60 feet in the water, in the mud. So a lot of the ship is still in the mud. So, and this mud's almost like a quicksand. So it's very difficult to, if they were even going to attempt to raise the Titanic, they'd be very difficult to do that because of the thick mud. These are electric cranes here. A lot of people always ask what this is. It's electric cranes. Here's the mast. This is where the crow's nest was at, where they spotted the iceberg when it once stood. This is the anchor crane right here. There's some davits here that once held lifeboats. And you can see the promenade, partially enclosed promenade still here. And these are officers' quarters. And this is actually the deck, was actually the bridge at one point. That is no longer there because it was made of wood. And they made it of wood because they didn't want the metal to interfere with compasses at the time. But this is a very large ship. It's kind of hard to put in perspective how big this ship is, but it is a huge ship. When Dr. Robert Ballard discovered it in 85, they kind of came up along the side of it here, and they just couldn't really understand how big this ship was until they saw it, because it is a huge ship. Here's a picture of Titanic's rail here. These are rusticles. These are the bacteria that eat the iron and form rusticles. And that's what's actually damaging the Titanic more than anything, is the rusticles. Here too is a anchor crane. This is one of Titanic's anchor cranes. These anchors weighed several tons, and they're still in place from when they were last used. And here's a very close-up picture of the bow and the anchor crane. Now, remember, as I said a minute ago, about 60 feet more of Titanic is buried in the mud. So this is literally just the top portion of it. A person would be about as tall as probably this anchor crane. So it just kind of puts in perspective how big these things are. This was a huge ship. I mean, it's kind of hard to fathom that, but it is a huge ship. And that's the anchor crane right here. And here's another viewpoint of the Titanic. And there's the anchor crane, the anchor, the mud when it collided with the seabed. There's some davits right there that once held lifeboats, and the mast and the electric cranes. So, and all kinds of other ship equipment here. So it's such a shame, but the Titanic is deteriorating very quickly. The bacteria are eating away at it very quickly. Obviously, the ocean salt, the acidity of the oceans impacting it. So we don't know how much longer it's going to be around. The company that has salvage rights to this ship, it's called RMS Titanic. They do periodically go and scavenge things in the debris field, and they were just down there about a month ago. They were doing more mapping of the debris field and of the ship to see the state of the ship, because they've not been down to it since 2010. So they wanted to see how it has deteriorated, and I'm sure it has, but they haven't released the photos yet, so I'll be anxious to see those. Here's what's left of the grand staircase in the Titanic. There's really nothing left of the grand staircase except for some posts. You know, the wood is all gone. Here is Captain Smith's quarters, the captain's quarters. There's his bathtub. That is no longer viewable. I believe that was taken back in the early 2000s. And in 2010, when they last went down there, this ceiling had collapsed. So you can no longer see the bathtub. You can see all the fixtures here. Of course, all the rusticles, the wood's gone. It is kind of sad to see all these things. So here's one of Titanic's propellers. There's a lot of controversy that Titanic and Olympic were switched because of insurance purposes, and that's not the case. These ships, before they were named, were given numbers. And so Olympic was given the number 400, and Titanic was given the name 401. And they etched these numbers on many parts of the ship. And the propellers were one of them. And you can see here 401 right there. That means it was Titanic. So that kind of puts that argument to bed. But a lot of people still feel that these ships were switched, and they wasn't. That was 401. That was Titanic. And these propellers, by the way, are huge. They're about the size of a person. They're about a little over 5 feet large, 6 feet. Actually, they're probably bigger than a person, around 6-7 feet long. They're huge. So again, here's a picture putting in perspective how deep Titanic is into the mud. So you can see how large it is. It's just absolutely just huge. All right, so moving on to the last ship here is the HMHS Britannic. That stands for His Majesty's Hospital Ship. It's also known as Titanic's Forgotten Sister. Britannic would have been an RMS, but because she never made it to passenger service and never carried mail, she never got that designation. So when they requisitioned her after she was finished, built in 1914, they made her a hospital ship. She never had all her grand interiors. They were built, but they never were installed in her. What few were installed in her, they had to take out to make room for a hospital ship. So here's a picture of Britannic in its White Star livery, or its White Star paint, before it became painted with the hospital ship livery. Again, identical in many ways to Olympic and Titanic. But actually, Britannic was the largest of the three sisters. It also had the partially enclosed promenade. It also had gantry davits. You see these davits here. They basically like crane davits. That had several of them, and each of these could hold 6 lifeboats each. And in addition, it also had other areas with lifeboats and rafts and things. So it held around 48 lifeboats. So if they learned their lesson from Titanic. So when Titanic sank, Britannic was actually still in the process of being built. So they went back to Britannic and they included a double hull. So if she did get hit by an iceberg, most likely it would survive. They added more lifeboats and just a little bit more modern technology, because Britannic did come a few years after Olympic and Titanic, but they took the lessons learned from Titanic and put them into Britannic. But these gantry davits could lower lifeboats very, very quickly, and they held them. They were motorized, so they were very, very fast. But it was the largest of the three sisters. It had about 2,000 more tons than Titanic did, just because of all the added safety features, the double hull, the gantry davits. So it had more weight, so it made it larger. As far as length go, it was about the same. It was launched in 1914, so about close to 2 years after Titanic. It also sunk. It sunk due to striking an underwater mine in 1916, and 30 people died. It actually did not sink in the Atlantic. It sank over in the Mediterranean Sea in Greece, off the island of Kea, Greece. The funny thing is, it only sits in 400 feet of water. So these ships are over 800 feet long. So when Britannic sank, half of it was still sitting out of the water when the bow had hit the bottom. That's because these ships were just huge. It sank in about 30 minutes versus where it took 2.5 hours for Titanic to sink. And one reason why Britannic sank so fast is because the mine obviously blew a large hole in her, but also the nurses had opened up the portholes to air out the ship. Back in those days, they were on their way to pick up more wounded, and back in those days, they figured that they would always open up the portholes to air out the ship to get it ready for the wounded, and that they left them open, and they weren't supposed to have done that, and that's what sunk the ship faster. There's a lot of debate on whether if the portholes had not been open, if Britannic would have survived, because it was only like 3 or 4 miles away from the coast. So it was very close to the coastline. So it may have made it if that had not happened, but we'll never know. But again, it was requisitioned as a hospital ship during World War I. It never saw commercial service. And Britannic was actually to be even more luxurious than Olympic and Titanic. Its grand staircase was going to actually be a little bit different. It was going to have an organ to welcome guests as they come down the grand staircase. So again, it never really got those things. All those luxury fittings were created. They were built. They just never got installed because she never saw that service. There was a lady on Britannic named Violet Jessup. She was a nurse. She was actually on board the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, and survived all three. Of course, Olympic never sank, but she was on the Olympic. But she saw all three of these ships, and she survived the Titanic and Britannic disaster. So this is a Titanic built in the slipway here, again, a gigantic ship. It was the same, it was built in the same slip as Olympic. So once Olympic was out of there, they were focusing, once Olympic was launched, they started finishing up Titanic. And once Titanic was launched, they started laying the keel for Britannic. So they could still make improvements to Britannic after Titanic sank. Here's a picture of Britannic's davits. You can see these gantry davits, and they're still on the ship today underwater. One thing I did want to mention about the funnels, Britannic's funnels are still in the water, although they're rusting. The Titanic's funnels are no longer existent. They were crushed by the water pressure. The funnels were made of very thin steel plates, and it basically is as a rust spot on the bottom of the ocean with Titanic. Britannic's is still there. They're flattened a little bit, but you can still recognize them. So here's a picture of some nurses on the Britannic. You can see all the sheets here, the curtains that would separate the beds for privacy. The hospital beds, again, this was a hospital ship. This is on a promenade deck, it looks. This probably would have been a first class promenade deck if it had been a ship. So, or a ocean liner, excuse me. So here is a picture of the wreckage of Britannic. Britannic actually lays on its side, on its starboard side. Titanic rests upright. Britannic laid on its side, and its bow, a good portion of its bow got broken off as it sank. Britannic is actually owned by a man named Simon Mills, who is a researcher in the Olympic class ships. He's very passionate about these ships. He wants to conserve them and protect them. And that's why he purchased this ship from the British government in 1996 for about 15,000 pounds. People that do scuba and visit Britannic, they actually have to have permission from him to do that and from the Greek government. So there are conditions that have to be met. And it is in 400 feet of water. So it's not exactly shallow water, but it's still, the depth's not as bad where they still get light. The light can still penetrate the water, but it is a humongous ship, as you can see here. This is a picture of some divers going up to it. It is just a huge ship. Again, remember, it's the largest of the three. Here is a picture of Britannic's spiral staircase. This is probably one of the, I think this is a fireman area where the firemen lived, firemen's quarters, but it had a spiral staircase. You can see the linoleum there, very beautiful linoleum. You can still see that. And one thing too about Britannic is that the water is very warm here, and it's not eating away at the ship as fast as Titanic is. The bacteria that's it's eating away the Titanic is a more cold water bacteria, and this is not the case with Britannic. It's not eating away as fast, although it is rusting, just not as quickly. It's kind of preserving it a little bit faster. Here are some fixtures, cold and hot water fixtures here. Looks like it's in a bathtub or a sink. You can see a little plunger here. And here's a bathtub here. So you see all the mollusks here on the wall, but still you can recognize the bathtub. And here's a picture of those gantry davits that we saw earlier. Here's one right here. See how big these things are. They're just humongous. And here's a picture of the propeller. So we can see here. Now, just imagine how big these things are. Look at this diver right here. Look how, I mean, he's probably, maybe 6 feet. And look, he's right underneath one of these propellers. That's how big these propellers are. They're huge. It actually had 3 propeller shafts, one on each side and one on the central underneath the rudder. So, and they can see these on Britannic. And that's one reason why they want to preserve Britannic, is because we can learn more about Titanic and Olympic, because we can actually get to Britannic. It's only in 400 feet of water. So we can actually get to it. Although obviously it's a wreckage, but it lets us learn a little bit more about these ships. And again, Britannic's always been known as Titanic's forgotten sister, because it is forgotten. Titanic's the most famous of the 3 because of the tragedy. But a lot of people tend to forget about Olympic and Britannic. But Olympic obviously was the only one that made it through a career of the 3 ships. But all 3 of these ships, and there's my references, were just beautiful. So, all right. Well, that is the presentation for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. We'll be doing some more presentations in the future on some of these ships. I'll probably do one on the Carpathia in the near future. So just kind of be on the lookout. So thank you all for watching.